Daf Lamed Beis in Beitsa. Although we might have started this Mishnah before, we're going to start it again just to get a running start for the new Zman, Bezrat Hashem. So Shabbatai was reading Ein Pochasin Es Haner. Literally, we don't diminish the candle, but in those days, a candle was like on Hanukkah when we have a small cup that holds oil. That's called a ner. That cup today may be made out of glass, but in their day was made out of pottery, which starts out as a chunk of clay. And the way that you create this receptacle is to carve out the inside. So in a sense, you're diminishing from the block, the chunk of clay. But as Shabbatai aptly translated it in this case would probably be best translated as we don't carve out the ner, because once you have if you have a glob of clay, it's not a kli, but as soon as you carve out the middle, you create a receptacle, which could theoretically start to be used already at that early stage as a receptacle for the oil, which then could be used as what we call a ner, as a candle. So you can't do that, says the Mishnah, Mipnei shehu oise kli, because that is called making a kli, which we'll see. This is the part of the chiddush of this Mishnah, is considered a kli even at this early stage when it's still like wet clay, as it were, rather than the normal procedure is to take that wet piece of clay, or in this case after you've carved out the middle, it's like the paradigm of the kli, which will eventually work as a proper candle, but usually fired up in a kiln of some sort, in a furnace of some sort, to make it a proper sturdy kli that's dried out and will endure. At this stage, when it's still moist and still more like a glob of clay, one might have thought it's not a kli yet, and therefore maybe this would have been permissible on Yom Tov. I'm not making a proper kli, therefore it's only like a precursor, as it were, and therefore maybe it's still permissible on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah, no. Even that primitive stage of creating a candle is asur. Okay, now the second halacha in the Mishnah, the ein osin pechamim. We're not allowed to create on Yom Tov charcoals, which I guess you make by taking wood and burning it and then stopping it in the middle and taking the half-burnt chunks, and they provide with a much higher level fire, much higher intense heat, which in their day, and even today in certain cases, like I know by making matzah, you need a very high level heat to cook it quickly. Those very glowing embers that are created through the charcoals create a very high level heat for producing certain important objects. Like matzah would be one example, as we said. There would be other types of things that you make in very intense heat. Certain manufactured items which you make by melting, let's say metal, etc., needs a high level heat. So you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov, even though theoretically you could use these same charcoals to cook food, which we would think is mutter on Yom Tov. So maybe this would be mutter on Yom Tov. We say no, ostensibly because it's not really for doing something on Yom Tov. Usually charcoals are used for doing stuff like manufacturing utensils, as we said. So that's certainly not permissible on Yom Tov. Okay. Third halacha now in the Mishnah. Shabbatai, you want to continue?
Okay. Ve'ein chotvin et tefillah.
Pitila. Okay, so slow down. What is it? What is that first halacha?
We don't cut a wick.
Right. So theoretically, the case would be a longer wick than you need, and you want to cut it down to size, which there is a malacha, one of the 39 malachas, which is making cutting things to a certain given size. You know what an example of that would be? Toilet paper, for example. The real Isser on Shabbos is cutting it along the lines, because you make even regulated, uniform pieces of paper. But to cut along, not at a normal place, would be mutter, at least b'di'evid. That's the Beitsa if you're on a John and you only have untorn toilet paper and you don't know what to do. You have to do something. Obviously, you're not right. You're allowed. The only Isser might be a Mr. Rabbanan, which the Rabbanan forego for the sake of what we call kavod habrios. But why isn't it Asur D'Oraisa? Because you're not supposed to cut along the dotted lines. You have to try to do it with the shinui, and also not in a uniform way. So if you cut it somewhere in the middle by hand and it doesn't turn out to be a perfect line, then it's like a jagged edge would be a good example of avoiding that. But here he wants to take the wick and he wants to cut it and make two, I say, equal wicks on either side. So he makes, or even if he has a much longer wick and then he keeps cutting, right? Like when you buy wicks for Hanukkah, they're all the same size, right? Someone had to sit there in the factory taking this long one and cutting it down to make a bunch of them that are the same size. So that's a malacha. It's one of the 30 malachas. So you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov, again, even though you may be wanting to use it for Yom Tov, but apparently the Rabbanan consider this to be making a kli, which we can see here already is an issue, at least midrabanan on Yom Tov. Keep going.
The Rabbi Yehuda, what the ur, you're able to cut it with a flake.
Right, like just holding the wick over a flame, it eventually will cut it into. Very nice. You see that your wife is a good shliach. Baruch Hashem. So good to see you.
Just stop the camera? Yeah, just got called to Mincha upstairs.
Oh, okay, because they didn't have the normal early mincha, so I know Sruli was looking for one. Do you want to take advantage of this one as well? You did? Oh, you did, so you didn't need a mincha.
I did have it myself.
Oh, you did need it.
Because I thought they were getting Mashiach.
So maybe turn it off for a second.
So I'm going to make some soup.
So there's going to be a mincha now, because there's a mincha at 5, I said. I saw according to the schedule. Okay, so man is like the English word man, or sometimes as a question, who is the man? And who's the man, who's the Tana, right? Because we're just finishing a Mishnah, so we look back at that Mishnah and said, who is that man who is in the Mishnah, the Tana who must have written this Mishnah? That de pechitat, from the word pachot. Pachot means less. Here it's like the reduction of. That holds that the reduction of, which as we said, you have a chunk of clay, and to create a receptacle, what you're really doing is you're gouging out the middle part of that chunk of clay. So I think Shabbatai used the translation of carving out, which is very apt, because it definitely it gives the picture of what you do. But to fit this word, the act of gouging out, carving out, and taking out the middle part of the chunk of clay, what you're really doing in essence is you're reducing that chunk. In a certain given way, you're reducing it, so you're diminishing it. So that's called pechisas ner. You're creating the ner through diminishing the chunk of clay. How do you diminish a chunk of clay? You don't just take half and throw it in the garbage. You gouge out the middle and create a receptacle, which can then hold the oil. So who is the Tana who holds that mere act of taking a wet piece of clay and just gouging out the middle and reducing, in a sense, the chunk of clay, that's already a manahu. That you could already say that made a kli. It's so primitive, right? It's like going way back to the caveman stage, of things, those things are called kalim. Well, if you ask Mr. Caveman, he says, yeah, he was very proud to create such a kli, right? He became the leader of the tribe when he learn that trick, right? But in our generation, we're pretty sophisticated people. In our day and age, not everyone would consider that a kli, right? They might actually tell you, go back to the cave if you want to use such a thing, right? Don't. But our Mishnah, by saying it's usher to do, is in its essence making a statement that it's called making a kli. Because why did the Mishnah make it usher? Because it is making a kli. It actually says in the Mishnah, B'knei she'osa kli. So the Mishnah actually says it clearly that is called making a kli, and that is why it's usher on Yom Tov. So who is the Tana who would say that such a rudimentary, basically wet glob of clay was just, all it has is just the cavity now that could be used to store stuff in, but come on, it's still wet, it's still slimy, who's going to use it? So, but whoever wrote our Mishnah obviously holds it is a kli and people would use it. But who is that? And we're going to see that it's a bit of a machlokus, so therefore we're really just leading into the fact that this is not so simple. It's a very controversial matter, which our Mishnah is taking sides on, but it is a controversial issue. That's the answer. It's Rebbe Meir, right, which doesn't really satisfy us because it's just like a name at this point, but it signifies a certain position that we find in a Beitsa. So the lead in to the the expose of that position is to say it's Rebbe Meir. But since you don't know what Rebbe Meir said, we'll inform you. Ditanya, because we learned in a Beitsa about it. Cheres. That's a samech. Okay, you see, it's a little bit more like a circle than a mem sofit would be more square at the bottom. This one on the right hand bottom side is a little bit shaved off. Right, that's what makes it a samech instead of a mem sofit. A little bit more like a circle. In fact, that's how we write it in script, right? When we write a samech in script, we write it as a circle, just a plain old circle. So that's even in print, it resembles somewhat a circle, much more so than a mem sofit. In any event, kli cheres. So that's what we've been talking about. A kli that's made out of ceramics, which means clay.
So
Oh.
when does it get to?
Now we know this Gemora only makes sense if you know the rule, which most of us probably have learned a few Gemoras that center on this topic, that there is no such thing as a kli that could be makabel tumah if it's not a finished product. As soon as you tell me it's not a finished product, you're basically telling me, even if you have all the maximum circumstances, you have a dead rat, you have everything ready to make it tameh, it doesn't matter. It's like plugging in something into the plug where the electricity's been turned off. It doesn't work. So if you know that rule, that something cannot be makabel tumah until it's a fully finished kli, then this makes sense, because it's saying, at what point will you consider these types of kalim finished products, and therefore ipso facto ready to be makabel tumah? Milachta.
The work is finished.
Right. And that means, okay, now, what I think that means, okay, let's see, Rashi gives a bit of a, yeah. Rashi says what he meant, and remember, we're saying Rebbe Meir, that we're reading right now, Divrei Rebbe Meir, he is the author of our Mishnah. That means what we just saw in this little Beitsa is really a reiteration of what we saw in the Mishnah. What do we see in the Mishnah? You take a glob of clay, this wet glob of clay, you carve out the middle, and all of a sudden you call it a kli. Right? So that's what he just said in other words. In this new Beitsa, he just said that same thing in other words. Meaning, when he said the finished work, what did he mean? Only the carving out. That's enough. That's the work. Work means the action that was done to the actual object. So the carving out is the act, and that's what Rashi says, by the way. If you look at Rashi, in the Gemora Rashi, the second Gemora Rashi, Misha Nigmar Malachta, Rashi uses one word to focus on what he's really saying. See the word Rashi uses down here? Second one. Misha Nigmar Malachta. right? What does Rashi say? What does the Gemora mean? What does Rabbi Meir mean when the work is finished? Rashi uses one word to focus on what that means. Chakikasam. See that, Rashi? That is what Rabbi Meir means. The malacha of the clay object, the clay utensil, is the carving out. And that's what he means. If the work is done, it's already makabel tumah. What work? The carving out. Which is exactly what it said in our Mishnah, right? You take that glob of clay, you carve out the middle, it's still a wet, slimy nothing. It's already usher to do on Yom Tov, and here we're seeing it from another angle, it's makabel tumah. Why? Because it's considered a kli already. And that's what our Gemora said, perfect shidduch, with our Mishnah. But here we see why it's controversial, and not everyone would agree with that. Keep going in the Gemora. Keep one hand on the Rashi if you can, and one hand in the Gemora. Rabbi Yoshua. Itzarfo. Right. So Misha, from the time that Yitzarfo, he will fire it up or dry it out, cook it in it's like an oven, furnace, right? What we call a kiln. So he's saying it's not enough just to gouge out that slimy piece of clay. Because what do you have now? Anyone want to use that slimy piece of clay that has a receptacle? According to Rabbi Yoshua, not. You have to take it and put it in a proper kli, because then you make it much more into a finished product. That's a finished product. Okay? Let's see Rashi on that one. Shabbatai, would you like to try Rashi?
Sure.
Misha Yitzarfo.
Misha
Yechazkein. From the word mechazek. He will strengthen it, or them. By means of
fire.
Right, which is like burning it up in the fire. But really we know the word siruf, because Rashi brought that down in the Mishnah. Remember Tzorfei Zahav, where the people who purified the gold, goldsmiths, so in a sense that's what you're doing to the clay, I suppose, by putting it in a kiln. They burn out the impurities, and that's one of the things that makes it stronger. In a kivshan, okay, and Rashi now actually talks about the word mitzaref. Where does this word come from?
Mitzaref, the lashon
Chachamim, meaning Rashi agrees that in Tanakh you might find other usages of this word that are not so matin to what he's explaining here. But in our Mishnah, or let's say this Beitsa, it's being used as lashon chachamim, right? This is exactly what we find in Mishnah as lashon chachamim. And he's saying it's a bit different than the lashon of Tanakh. So this word in the lashon of chachamim connotates what? Maksheh.
To strengthen and harden the klicher.
That's right. Okay. V'kli matchot, which is metal. Matechet, it means metal, so the plural is matchot. Clay matchot, or mas, right? They have a different way of talking about it, apparently.
Doesn't have to become hard.
Huh? Yeah, according to Rabbi Meir, even though it's not yet hardened and not yet the kind of tea that you and I would want to sip our tea from, right? But still, this is probably what we were saying before. The number of people would still use it at this point. At the crude stage, it can function, and enough people would use it at that crude stage of functionability, whatever you call it. That makes it enough people that you could call it a finished product already. But I could certainly hear Rabbi Yeshua's point. So, okay, let's see. So the last thing I think Rashi is just trying to show that the way that you harden up an earthenware vessel is by putting it in fire, in an oven. But what about a kli that's made out of metal? There's a whole different process there. I don't know why he really has to tell us that, but he's being a bit more thorough about the whole subject
Bein
here.
the Mayim, bein the Ur.
Yeah,
Between fire and water. Water and fire.
it can be both in water and fire, right? It can do either to strengthen and to finish up. You do find that subject brought up. I think I remember it being brought up on Yuma, that they had certain brass balls or something they used to heat up, and they said that with the water, maybe you're finishing up the product, and a whole discussion about that. Anyway, okay, but that's not our subject here, so I don't know exactly why Rashi brought it up, but okay. Thank you, Rashi, for being thorough. In any event, okay, so that's the Machlokas, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yeshua. So, regardless of how we paskin, the Gemora is saying that our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he created this Mishnah, he decided to adopt the Shita of Rabbi Meir, and he actually ignored Rabbi Yeshua. Maybe it's a Chumrah, just because he wants you to be extra careful on Yom Tov. Maybe that's the point. But whatever. Okay, so now the Gemora is going to object to that comparison. So who would like to continue? Yisruli?
Yeah.
Back in the Gemora now with the objection from Abaye
Abaye says
to Rav Yosef,
to Rav Yosef,
which is a very common thing, that Abaye was like, Rav Yosef was his mentor, or at one point he was his Rebbe, so he very often asked questions from Rav Yosef.
From where do we know Dilma?
So Mimai sort of stands on its own.
From where do we know?
From how do you know? How do you really know what you just said is true, right? In other words, you made a comparison. Our Mishnah, which is really not talking about Tuma, it's talking about making a Kli on Shan Yom Tov, making it even not a regular Kli, like a little tiny Kli to hold the Shemin. And over there they're talking about, we're going to see from Rashi, he's learning, it's talking about much bigger Kalim of Kli, of clay. So he's saying, how do you, basically what we would say in modern English in a sort of a crude way, how do you come off? How do you come off making this comparison? So, but literally, mimai could be taken as like a sincere question. From what are you deriving your proof? From what are you really deriving your proof that these are two comparable positions? The position in our Mishnah, which is talking about a small little tiny piece of clay that you gouge out, and this other one that they're talking about over there, which is a much larger piece of clay. That's the way Rashi seems to learn, why he feels it's not a good comparison. And now he explains why he thinks that would make a big difference, and they can't be compared, because once you assume that that's true, that our Mishnah is talking about a small piece of clay that you gouge out, and over there it's a much larger piece of clay, so then once you assume that that's true, then you have the right to ask, Dilma, perhaps
Adkan Lok Omar Rabbi Meir
Hassam.
Perhaps only until now Rabbi Meir did not say.
So say it in the positive. Rabbi Meir only said over there that gouging out is enough, and you don't have to put it in the kiln. Maybe he only said it over there because at least it's chazi.
It's fitting.
It is fit, not fitting. Fitting more is like etiquette. Not fitting, but more it's fit. It means it's capable. It's capable of, it's fit for the job of what?
To accept something.
Right, but accepting, again, it has a connotation of like accepting Shabbos or accepting a Chumrah. It's not the accepting part that we're focusing on. It's like holding within itself as a receptacle. That's called Mekabel as well. You can use it to hold inside of itself things, right? So if you're talking about a much larger piece of clay and you gouge it out, it can hold a lot of stuff inside of it. That's what Kabule means here, not accepting or really, but more the idea of being able to contain within itself a large number of objects, so therefore it has a function, right? In other words, it functions. Even at that crude stage, it can function. It can offer a lot of utility, right? You can get a lot of use out of it as being able to hold within it stuff. That's a good function. Therefore, Rabbi Meir could say, it's already a good functional item, it's Makabel Tuma. So Abai is trying to say, but that's very different from our case, because our case is a tiny little piece of clay, the way Rashi learns. And that's how, like, if you think about Hanukkah, these tiny little glass little receptacles of, right, all you need is a tiny bit of shemen to light for a long period of time. So all you need is a tiny receptacle. So that's maybe Rashi's right to learn that that's a biased pshat. That he's talking about our Mishnah, looking at our Mishnah as tiny little globs of clay that you gouged out the inside of it. Okay? And therefore he's saying in our Mishnah, maybe Rebbe Meir wouldn't agree that it's already a kli. Because what? In our case, hacha.
Hacha means over here, lamai chasi.
Okay, that's his question. What is it really so fitting for? If it hasn't been put in the kiln, he's saying it's still a wet. It's not only wet and slimy; it's tiny little things. So what could you use it for? Rashi learns it's not even fit to use it as a candle yet, because it's like wet. So therefore, it's really no one's going to pour into this wet little thing their oil, because the whole thing's just going to fall apart. It really needs to go into a kiln. So the whole sheet of Rebbe Meir that it has a function even when it's wet only makes sense if it can still hold other objects without falling apart. That's a much bigger kli made out of clay that could do that. But this tiny little thing would not really function, so therefore why would Rebbe Meir think that this makes it into a kli? So he's basically throwing a monkey wrench into the works and saying, even Rebbe Meir, who's willing to call something a kli at the crude stage of a wet piece of clay that's gouged out, but it's only if it's large enough to hold simple objects and serve some kind of function. Then you can say, okay, it's already functional, it could makabel tuma. But in our Mishnah, it's a tiny little thing. What could it really hold to give it a function? It's not going to hold shemen, Rashi says, because it's just going to fall apart. So what could it hold at this point to give it a functionality to say, oh, you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov, it's creating a kli. He's trying to say, maybe, I don't think Rebbe Meir would agree. You have to find some other Tana. So the Gemora answers Abaye and says,
for
no.
anything here, like his Mishnah.
Yeah, that's what he's claiming. He's claiming that it's just not functional. And even Rebbe Meir, it has to actually have a function to be called a kli. So over there it does. Over Abayas it doesn't really have a function. That's what Abaye is trying to claim. But the Gemora answers, no, I could find a function for it, which would be what? No, before that. The Gemora answers his claim, the Lamai Chazi, by saying it is the Kabule.
They should to accept little coins.
Right, to hold small little coins it could be, or small little pieces of copper. And those things are, you don't want to let them just lie around or they'll get lost. In those days when every little thing mattered, you like to keep track of small pieces of metal, even small coins. Like my father used to have a change thing in his dresser. I always knew what to go and get No, it was actually just like with the big cup.
Rebbe Abaye is trying to discredit Rebbe Meir.
No, it's not discrediting. He's saying his Rebbe, Rav Yosef, had claimed that the author of our Mishnah would be Rebbe Meir, clearly.
Right.
Because he doesn't require it to go into the kiln. It's already a kli before that. And even though it's still a wet, slimy little nothing, but at least it has a function. But says Abaye, think about it. Think what you're talking about. It's not just a formula. You take a wet piece of clay, you gouge it out, it's makabel tuma, or it's called a kli. It depends. It has to have a function. So he's claiming that over there, where Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehoshua argue, there is a function. You can find, since it's a larger object that's been gouged out, you can have plenty of things that it can hold, even at the stage where it's a wet, slimy piece of clay. But he's saying over here, by us, it's a small little thing, so you really don't have a function for it yet. So how could our Mishnah, it can't be Rebbe Meir who would agree, you have to find someone else. That's he's arguing against Rav Yosef, who was trying to find an author for our Mishnah. He's saying, I don't think you found an author. Because you can't just claim that Rebbe Meir would say every single time you gouge out a piece of wet clay, it's going to create a kli. So who in the Mishnah would say that? Who is the author of our Mishnah? Back to square one, according to Abaye. But the Gemara says, no, if your real question is functionability, it has to have at least one function. I can find you one function. A small little piece of clay that's gouged out, is still pretty handy if you're trying to keep track of small little pieces of metal or small little coins.
Pins.
It could be, but pshiti is usually just raw metal or small pieces of or small coins, more like copper, I think. It's probably from the word pashut, which means simple. So I think it ends up meaning like simple pieces of metal, simple coins or simple pieces of metal, like small little pelts or whatever. Pallets, yeah. So they're hard to keep track of. You're happy to have a small little kli to put them in to keep track of them. In any event, that's what the Gemora is answering. So at this point, Abaye's objection has been answered. Of course, sometimes we feel that the question was stronger than the answer, but in the end of the day, the Gemora seems to accept the answer, even if it's not such a strong answer. But especially since we have no other candidates as the author of our Mishnah, certainly we're inclined to accept it, in the end of the day. So far, that's how our Mishnah stands. Our Mishnah is written by Rabbi Meir, which, by the way, anyways, makes sense because we often say Shtam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. Right? That's how Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sort of rolled, that he often took Rabbi Meir's opinion and worked it into the Mishnah as a Stam Mishnah, which means there's no name attached to it. It's like from the word Satun, which means closed up. It's as if it's like a closed book. We don't know who wrote it, and it's just like an anonymous opinion, which often connotates the majority opinion. So it's as if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came and took an individual's opinion and made it look like the majority opinion, which was his prerogative as Posek Hador and the editor of the Mishnayos. He could do what he wanted. That was his prerogative. But the Gemora, that's the beauty of the Gemora, will often come along and say, even if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wanted to paskin like that, because it wasn't his prerogative as Posek Hador, but we are in charge of the larger Klal Yisrael now, and we may not agree with that based on other opinions. So it's a little bit like the Ramah versus Rabbi Yosef Karo. When he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he often took very limited views of the Rambam, the Rosh, whatever, and very often the Ramah will open it up and say that the Rashba argues this. He'll open it up to more opinions and try to make it a bit more complicated. So he'll sometimes be machmir because of that or whatever. So certainly we appreciate what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did, but we also more so appreciate the Gemora that opened it up like it's doing here and saying it may look like everybody agrees with it, but it's not really true. Rabbi Yeshua argues, and it's very possible that the Halach would argue. In fact, if you look in the Beitsa where we got Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yeshua said, Mishi Yatzarfo B'Kivshan. It actually has a little letter next to that word Mishi Yatzarfo, a little hey, if you notice, which signifies on the upper right outside corner, the Ein Mishpat. He tells you where to find any given halacha in the Gemora, where to find it in the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, and also one or two other Rishonim. So often that signifies where the real halacha is. It's not a cut and dry thing. You can't always just assume wherever you find one of these little letters that is the halacha. But here it seems pretty obvious that he chose to put the hey to tell you to look up the halacha next to Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, and not next to Rabbi Meir's opinion. Which means that I'm inclined to believe that in Hilchos Tuma, at least, the Rambam passes like Rabbi Yeshua, that it's not considered to be Makabel Tuma till it gets into the Kivshan, because it's still a slimy piece of clay. And he doesn't agree with Rabbi Meir that it's enough just to have a few people willing to put their objects on it. You have to be a proper finished kli to be Makabel Tuma. And for that you need to be fired up in the kiln.
The thing is that these clay things, that if you let them sit, they'll dry.
They will dry.
They'll dry.
They will dry. Okay, but you see Rashi's making it clear the firing it up in the kiln does two things. More than just drying, it also strengthens it and hardens it even more than the norm. So apparently, it's like the difference between having a plate that'll last for many years and serve you well, or a plate that might fall apart at any time. So, in any event, I'm just pointing out that even though there's also a letter next to the halacha in the Mishnah that says you're not allowed to do this kind of a thing on Yom Tov to create this receptacle of a ner, ein pochasin es a ner. There's a little letter next to that as well, which leads me to believe that on Yom Tov it is asur, as our Mishnah says, and yet, if it's written by Rabbi Meir, you should find that we passing like Rabbi Meir in Hilchos Tumah, but that's not true according to this. If this is correct, that the Ein Mishpah puts a letter next to Rabbi Yeshua, that a mere piece of clay that becomes a receptacle is not good enough to be Makabel Tumah. So even though the Gemora here is making some kind of an equation, at the end of the day, the poskim don't buy it. It's almost like Abaye is correct in a way, right? There is no real equation between our Mishnah and this halacha, but the Gemora is making the equation, and Abaye's objection is dealt with. So theoretically, everything's hunky-dory. But it might also depend on this new version, because the Gemara comes on to a new version here. Yikuda Amri. Okay, but so far so good. Any questions?
So for Rabbi Meir.
Huh?
Trying to bring a case away from Mishnah for second Rabbi Meir. Our mission.
What are you saying about Rabbi Meir?
We hold some to our key it's not fired up. It could be used.
In our Mishnah, it's not fired up. Okay. In our Mishnah calls that making a kli, even though it's not fired up in the kiln yet.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gemara was bothered by that. Who could have held that way? Who really holds that way? It looks like it's Rabbi Meir. And then Abai says, well, maybe not. Maybe even Rabbi Meir wouldn't call this a kli yet. It doesn't really have a function. Which the Gemara said there is a function. You know, a proper kli, that's more like a proper cup. I think there are proper cups up there.
Plastic cup.
We have plastic cups here.
No.
Plastic cups.
I think they're in the back there.
There are some down there, some real cups. These are more shot glasses. I brought them from shot glasses.
Used to be. Listen.
Look, you can use it. I'm not saying you can't use it. It's just smaller than the normal cup, so you may want to. Okay.
Seems like a bit of a stretch to say that it is suitable. It can hold little bits of clay, little bits of metal. I mean, it's quite.
Yeah, I think the question was better than the answer personally, but I still appreciate, if you think about it, in the Maklokas Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Meir, right? Regardless of our Mishnah, just over there when we're talking about Hilchos Tumah, according to Rosh, it's a bigger kli.
Right.
Rabbi Meir is willing to call it a kli before you put it in the kiln.
Right.
Okay. Now the Gemora seems to understand that to be because it has a certain function. So that seems to be Rabbi Meir's shita. He's not hung up on like the aesthetics of it, or whether people enjoy using it. Because certainly I wouldn't enjoy using a wet piece of clay, right, to put my steak on it in the middle of Yom Tov or something, right? But Rabbi Meir does consider it a finished product. So you have to get into Rabbi Meir's way of looking at things. He doesn't care how many people are going to use it, or he doesn't seem to care about the aesthetics or the fact that most people will end up drying it in a kiln. So he seems to be focusing on another point when he says it's a finished product and it's makabel tumah. For him, functionability seems to be the key. The Gemora does have a point there, right? In other words, that's why our Gemora is focusing on that, and that's why I think, even though Abai is really asking the question, he's also giving us the key to understanding the Gemora's approach. That you really don't understand Rabbi Meir, how could you call this a kli at this point, unless you start getting into that way of thinking, functionability.
Isn't that in your Kimta?
No. Rosh, well, you could ask Rashi's explanation of Abai, that he's learning our case is small and over there is big, but that might just be the norm, right? A normal nair might be a tiny little object, right? Like you think of some people I know, there's some people who have very large containers for the oil on their menorah, but most people I know have these tiny little glass things, right? Which all you need is a tiny bit of oil in there, it could last a few hours. So that's how, I don't know if Rashi justifies how he knows that, but it definitely explains why Abai thinks he has a good kasha. But, okay, you could have called that a nukimta, but you see, the reason why you can't call it a nukimta is because it really has to work the other way around. You can't assume it's a case to ask your question. Isn't it talking about this case and therefore I have a good question? What gives you the right to assume it's talking a weird case that you should have a right to ask your question? That's not the way things work. It has to be that there's an assumed case that my question therefore makes sense. I can't say, well, I think it might be talking about a weird case and then I have a good question, right? It doesn't work like that. It works the other way around. I can ask a question if the assumed case is difficult to understand, and then you can come up and say, but it's not talking about that case, it's talking about a weird case. That's an acceptable answer. Because to ask a question, you have to have a strong basis to ask a question. Okay? But to answer a question, it's what's called a dechia. All I have to do is divert your question. And say, maybe you're right, but maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's talking about some weird case. My maybe is talking about a weird case will deflect your question adequately. But to ask a question, you can't create a case that's like a weird case, and then I can ask my question. You don't have a right to do that. To ask a question has to be based on the fact that your assumed case is a strong question. So it's not a nukimta. It's not a nukimta. Rashi says what's going on in Abai's mind, but it's obvious to the people who read these Mishnayos that our case, which is a small little ner, is a small little object. Whereas over there, they were talking about regular kalim that go into, which the norm was to have a normal size plate or a normal size bowl or other things which are, the normal size is much bigger. So maybe Rashi thought of it, that that's the distinction between our Mishnah, and that's what gives Abai the basis for his question. But the truth is, I don't think it's a stretch. I can understand what he's saying in retrospect. I didn't understand that way originally. I had no idea why he was asking the question until I saw the Rashi. But once I have the Rashi under my belt, I say, Rashi's right. That would explain the question. And it also makes sense that you're allowed to assume that ours is small and theirs is big, because that's the norm. But an ukimta only works as an answer. But if you ask me a question, I can say, you're right, under normal circumstances that would be a question, but I think it's possible at least that it's talking about a weird case, and therefore I can deflect your question and say it's not applicable in the weird case. But anyhow, that's just the way ukimtas work. You can't ask an ukimta, you can't ask a question based on ukimta, you can answer a question based on ukimta. In other words, you're allowed to suppose that it might be talking about a weird case to get out of a question, but you're not allowed to suppose it's a weird case to ask a question. It has to be the norm. So you have to say the norm was a small little container to make a ner, and the norm was a bigger container that they would normally talk about putting in a kiln, a potter, making kalim. Like if you go to a pottery store, what do you find all over the place there? Big kalim. I'm not talking even about the real big stuff, just the normal plates, cups, bowls. They're bigger than what we use on Hanukkah to light our menorah, those tiny little glass containers. So I think I understand why, especially in their day, things are much more expensive than today. So then, people were poverty stricken. So therefore, they would, everyone needed a ner. So you had to have something that was affordable. It had to have small little containers. In any event, so that's what Rashi says to set off the question. But I'm saying the fact that they're focusing on functionality, it shows you that the Gemora had an insight into Rabbi Meir's Shita. That how could he argue against Rabbi Yeshua? It's so logical to say you need to put it in the kiln to call it a finished product. I wouldn't want to use a slimy, wet piece of clay for eating my salad. Right?
The Pastor's Middle says that we won't read that the Tanoim don't argue about rare things. They argue more about more common things. So this seems to be like this little piece of
this
bread.
is, the making a ner is common. That's the real subject of this Mishnah.
They're putting things in. That seems very rare. Who would do that?
First of all, our Mishnah is talking about a small object because that's what a ner was, according to Rosh. That was the norm.
Yeah.
So the norm is not called a rare case. If that's what their neros were, these tiny little containers that held a small amount of oil, but that was enough for them to last, because they weren't like us, so they stayed up till like 12 o'clock at night, They needed a bit of, to do a few things after sundown, after Seisa Chachavim, and then they went to bed very early. So I can even understand why most people didn't even need these large containers of, even on Shabbos, they took in Shabbos early very often, and etc. In any event, so it seems like, again, it's a normal case, but to talk about it at the first stage when it's still wet, that you could say, well, most people would wait to use it when it's in a kiln. Which you can see even from Rashi is true. That's Abai's argument. You're not going to really use it as a nair till you put it in the kiln. The only thing the Gemara ends up saying you could really use it for at this stage is to put little objects in it. But the real thing that we said, making a nair, on a nair, most people wouldn't even use it as a nair at that point. But the whole idea of Rabbi Meir that we find arguing against Rabbi Yeshua, I think you have to appreciate that Abai is understanding the mentality of the Gemara, that the normal understanding of Rabbi Meir is it's centered around functionality. That's the only reason why he would call it a finished product, a makabel tuma, even before he put it in the kiln. Because by him, functionality is the important factor. So Abai says, look, since we're talking about Rabbi Meir, and it's all focused on functionality, that there has to be a function at least. If there's no function, it doesn't even start. The only reason why he had the gumption to argue against Rabbi Yeshua is because he felt there's functionality at the earlier wet stage. But if there's no functionality, then there's no Rabbi Meir. So Abai is focused on the real point. I think it's actually a good case point where you see Abai's question is actually opening the door to understand the normal way of thinking. Rabbi Meir makes sense if you look at it from the functionality point of view. And that's what he's objecting to. It's all based on functionality, but in our case, there's real no functionality at this point. So how can the Mishnah call it a kli?
So here in the Gemara says that it is functional?
Well,
it's like
since it's set up as a question and answer between Abai and Rav Yosef, his mentor, it seems like it's Rav Yosef's answer. Except you could claim often the Gemara is just what's called the Tsama de Gemora. That means later on in generation, when they followed through on these discussions, people in the Beis Midrash said there's an obvious answer, even if Rav Yosef didn't think of it. So it could be Rav Yosef himself. The merit of saying that is because the Gemara does set it up as Rav Yosef and Abaye, who wasn't just some faraway guy who just heard about what Rav Yosef said. He really lived with Rav Yosef. He even helped Rav Yosef. At one point, Rav Yosef became blind, and Abaye Mamish helped him. He was like Shamish. And not only that, Rav Yosef also forgot all of his learning. At one point, he had like a weird case of amnesia, forgot all his learning, and Abaye helped him remember it again. It's like they lived hand in hand. There's another mentor of Abaye, a Rabbah, who was actually like his surrogate father. Abaye was a Yasam. Even his real name wasn't Abaye. Abaye is just a Rosh for being a Yasam. It's from a pasuk in Eicha. And so at the early part of his life, he lived with Rabbah, and Rabbah was his Rebbe. Later on, apparently, he lived with Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef was his Rebbe. And they really helped each other physically. And he helped Rav Yosef physically. So they're having a discussion here. I can imagine it's Rav Yosef answering, even though the Gemara doesn't say it as Amr Le, Rav Yosef. It almost doesn't need to because we already know they have an intimate relationship. If it was someone else asking the question who was like from live far away, I would say maybe it doesn't necessitate learning that the person himself answered. Then we could just say the people who normally discuss these topics in Bavel, which is what the Gemara really is, a recounting of the discussions of all these things in Bavel. It could be anybody. It could be just the way that the Beis Midrash agreed was a good answer. So that would be acceptable, but I don't think you need to say it here. I think it was probably Abaye and Rav Yosef the whole way. But there are plenty of Gemaras that this answer is just given by the Gemara. Who's the Gemora? People in Babel who would sit around discussing this, who they were Talmid Chachamim, but they are nameless, they're anonymous. But they all said, it makes sense that this would be the answer. All right.
Rabbi Meir was one of the tzaddikim killed by the Romans. We mentioned
Malchus?
that we read about him in Yom Kippur.
I don't think he's one of the 10. I don't remember him as being one of the 10. He was persecuted, though.
He was with Rabbi Akiva.
He came with
Rabbi Akiva in that group.
Trying to think of who his Rebbe was.
I've got my book here.
Yeah, I don't think so, but...
Margalit and I are reading a book of history.
It's a short summation of Jewish history. It's very interesting. Is it true that Mashiach has to come before 6,000?
I don't know, there's a weird Rashi somewhere that says that the whole world's going to lie fallow for the last 1,000 years. I'm not sure how it's going to work out. But one thing we know for sure, Hashem is doing it, and he's all benevolent, and he's all good. Whatever he has planned out is going to be good.
Is Gemora Rosh Hashanah?
We're reading this book on
Gemora is. I remember there's a Gemora that talks about the last 1,000 years, sort of being a Shabbos of history, where there's 6,000 years, and the last is like a Shabbos, like everything lies fallow for 1,000 years. But whatever it is, I mean, hopefully it'll be good. Anyways, we all know this is not the Iker. This is called the hallway before the banquet hall. So this is all just to get ready. Everything we're doing right now is just to get ready for the real feast. Whether it's in Olam Haba or after Mashiach comes, there'll be different stages. Wow. We read the Ramchal, he is in Derech Hashem. I think he speaks about these things and how things are going to play out. Also, the Rambam has a bit of a discussion about how things are going to play out when Mashiach comes, etc.
So that someone knows.
Yeah, I mean, the great sages know, because they know all the Midrashim, they know all the Zohar, they know all the Yerushalmi.
And that's beyond us. We have to
Huh?
That's beyond us.
Look, if you really want to look into it, you can find people who talk about it, but I just think there's so much more to worry about.
Yes.
Some people are the other way around. I hope he doesn't come right now because I still have a lot of things to fix up. I hope I have a little bit of time left They actually say it takes a much more courageous person to daven for Mashiach, because it's kind of crazy for it to daven for Mashiach. Mashiach will come, I'll be like, I remember when we used to thunderstorm, we had a dog, a poodle. He would become so terrified of the thunder. Yeah, I think so.
Is Rabbi Meir the same as...
He would scramble under a bed, under my parents' bed. I remember him.
Turn the camera
terrified
off.
of the thunder.